Cool. So hi everyone. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, depending on where you are. We're very happy to be here with you all. Thank you to our speakers, Dr. Ali, for now. Let's see. So, okay, I was just going to wait a few minutes, but let's get started. My name is Rana Osman, and I'm a PhD student in the School of Law here at South University of London. I also work as a policy researcher for a university-based project called ICOP. Then I'll introduce ICOP to you. The ICOP stands for the Influencing Corridors of Power project. Like I said, it's housed at South University of London. It aims to promote sort of the impact of university-based research on primarily British policymakers. It is led by Professor Alison Scott-Bauman, and the research sort of seeks to bridge the gap between researchers and Westminster by addressing the specifically democratic deficit resulting from government control over freedom of speech and assembly on campuses. Our main innovative approach involves creating a platform for academics and experts to author evidence-based recommendations for actual policy change through one-pager briefings on current and upcoming parliamentary debates and legislation, all of which are delivered directly to all MPs and Lords inbox. I'll share the link to the project so you can become familiar in case you want to get involved in some way. I think, okay.
Rana, I think Khalid is having a problem with his video as well.
Yeah, okay. Could you try now, Professor Khalid? And Dr. Abdeslam?
There we go. Thank you. I thought you disinvited me.
Not at all. Not at all. This cannot go on without you, Khalid. Lovely to see you.
It's great to see everyone. Thank you for having us.
Good to see you, Professor Khalid and Dr. Abdeslam as well. So I think now we have a quorum. We have everybody, all of our panelists. So I'm going to move on to introduce our lovely host and moderator, Nada. So Nada is a full-time lecturer here at the University of London, SOAS University of London in the School of Law. Nada's primary research is concerned with international law and the impact of international institutions on developing countries and is themed around governance, development, and democratization. Her early academic work used game theory to gauge the effect of prosecutions by the International Criminal Court on internal political dynamics in developing countries, specifically using Sudan as a case study. She's also conducted research on the construction of the Marawi Dam in North Sudan to study patterns of mobilization around environmental struggles for the Economic and Social Research Council, the ESRC. Her research on the Marawi Dam uses tools and methodologies borrowed from international relations, media studies, and political science. Currently, she's working on a book on the politics of international criminal law using Sudan as a paradigmatic case study. And without further ado, hand it over to you.
Thanks, Rana. Rana, can I just quickly say that Hussam is not online yet? So I'll leave it with you, shall I?
Okay, tamam. Yeah,
okay, great. All right, thank you very much, and welcome everyone to this panel. The panel is titled How to Lose a Country in One Day, the Conflict in Sudan and the Politics of Revolutionary Change. I just want to congratulate you to begin with for making it to the webinar on a Wednesday evening. So we're very grateful. This is the 5th panel of our Sudan seminar series, which we started in September of last year, spurred on by the events that were ongoing in Sudan in 2021. The said events, and I'll talk a little bit about them further on, in effect threatened the country's already precarious path towards democracy. So my co-organizer and I started the series in response to the October 25th coup. And the coup was jointly done by the Sudan Armed Forces and the Rapid Support Forces, who are the parties to the current conflict. So I might be referring to them, and my speakers might as well, as the SAF and the RSF. The coup appended the constitutional document that the military acceded to following the popular uprising in April of 2019. And at the time, in 2019, the said uprising managed to oust the former president, Omar al-Bashir. But in a sense, the constitutional document and the following transitional government arrangement was a compromise on the demands of the Sudanese people for a civilian government that will pave the way for a democratic transition. However, and I assume taken by surprise in the summer of 2019, the international community, including the African Union and regional powers, were more than happy for this accommodation of the remnants of the al-Bashir regime. However, the effect of the 2021 coup was practically to sideline an already weak and ineffectual civilian component of the transitional government, which was under the leadership of Abdullah Hamdok. Following the said coup, and for those of you who might not know this, several members of the civilian component of the government, as well as members of the wide and all-encompassing opposition coalition of the Forces of Freedom and Change, the FFC, or Al-Hurriya wa Taghyir, were arrested by both SAF and the RSF. Since then, both parties, the Sudan Armed Forces and the Rapid Support Forces, have been seeking political partners in order to garner some legitimacy in their attempt to assert power in Khartoum. In short, this is the context for the current conflict that has been unfolding in Sudan since April 15th of this year. And just to put it in perspective, the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs statistics for what's going on in Sudan as a result of the conflict today includes 1.9 million displaced people, including internally and externally across the borders, and almost 1,000 people killed and 6,000 injured, as well as 24 million people in need of urgent assistance. But in today's event, what we will be focusing on is the question of what actually led to this situation in the first place. Despite the multiple signs that a conflict in Khartoum was inevitable. I was actually there in December of last year, and I practically advised people to leave the country because it smelled like war. So today we have a great panel of distinguished academics, practitioners, and activists who will be addressing this question, and will also be talking about how or what is the implication for this of this conflict on the December revolution in Sudan, which aspired for the transition to democracy. So the way that I'm going to be doing this is I will introduce each speaker in turn. They will be given 10 to 15 minutes. I'll be timing them. And then once all the speakers have done their segment, I will be kickstarting the discussion with asking them some questions. I hope this works for everyone, yeah? All right, okay, so our first speaker is Dr. Ali. And Dr. Ali is a teaching fellow at SOAS. Ali teaches Islamic law and Islamic finance law. And he also published on a wide range of subjects, including political Islam and contemporary Islamic thought and philosophy. He has a book called Ashab al-Haq, which was published by Al Jazeera in 2014. And it's a treatise on the contemporary political Islam and Islamic movements. He also published a paper on the effects of classical Islamic jurisprudence on economic policy and regularity directives in Muslim countries. Recently, in 2019, he published an article that I'm gonna say in Arabic, خيارات الثورة السودانية, which basically, Ali, can you help me with the translation if there is one?
I suppose the potential scenarios for
potential
the
scenarios
Sudanese,
for the
Sudanese
Sudanese revolution. He has been an active political writer and commentator, as well as an analyst. And he writes regularly on Sudan, the Middle East, and political economy, as well as legal and religious reform in Muslim countries. So we'll hear from Ali first, and then I'll introduce the next speaker afterwards. Okay, go ahead, Ali.
Thank you very much, Nada. Thank you, Rana, as well. And my assalamu alaikum, my greetings to all people present and my fellow panelists. I have had a last minute idea of preparing a PowerPoint presentation. This wasn't part of the plan, but I thought instead of just boring you with monotone kind of presentation, I might just put the presentation together. So I'm hoping I can get this up somehow. I've been trying to find where to do it from when Nada was speaking, but I confess I don't know how to.
There's like a green button in the middle, where sort of your mic, the row where your mic camera is located on the bottom of your screen.
Yeah.
Does it say? Do you see it? Share screen?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Are you able to press on it? Like, do you have access? You should.
Oh, right. Okay.
Excellent.
Okay. Right. I just hope. Okay, so that's the beginning. Okay, so this is the an image, I think, that tells the story of Khartoum now, and conscious of the limitations in time, I'm trying to limit my briefing about the history of how we got here, and tell the story of the RSF in one picture. And this, I'm sure you are familiar with. This is Napoleon from the Animal Farm, the George Orwell story, and his dogs. Now, this tells the story of the RSF in my view, with the one exception, one change, which is that the dogs at the end of the story actually ate Napoleon. This happened in Sudan many times. So it's not just the recent events. It happened all the way back in the 16th century in this dynasty of Sinnar. And it happened again with Hassan al-Turabi, who brought Bashir to power. And Bashir toppled and took over after 10 years. And then it happened again with the RSF and Hemeti, who was raised in the ranks of power by al-Bashir to protect him, and he even dared to call him Himaiti. But he joined the ranks in the military who toppled Bashir in 2019, and he was in alliance with Burhan, and 2 months well, it's 2 months now, in the 15th of April this year, he attempted a coup against Burhan, and he was actually aiming to kill him. So that's the story of you raising the beast and then ending up eaten by the beast. This is the diagram that I made in 2019 with the article that Nada talked about, which is trying to imagine the possible scenarios. This article was written only a couple of weeks after the mass demonstrations in the 30th of June 2019, which changed the landscape, the political landscape in Sudan, and prevented a quick return to authoritarian rule by the alliance of the Burhan and Hemeti. Now, my logic was that any authoritarian rule cannot be defeated by a peaceful revolution or peaceful demonstrations, except by the ruler, declaring his submission to the revolution for some reason, one reason or the other, or if the ruler flee, the scene like Bin Ali did in Tunis. But none of this seemed to be the case in Sudan in 2019. It was quite obvious that they were hanging on to power, both Burhan and Hemeti. And people were talking about possible scenarios for the revolution then. I'm trying here to, this is not obvious, this is obviously not a comprehensive set of scenarios, but it's the likely scenarios, or at least the logical scenarios that people were contemplating. I imagine that civil war was not a highly likely scenario, and I still think that it's not likely, and I'll try and explain if I have time later on. The other scenario was that the revolution would be defeated, and this happens in either of two ways. One way is that a military confrontation between the RSF and the SAF, the Sudanese Armed Forces, would end with a victory for the RSF. And again, I don't think this was a likely scenario, and I still think it's unlikely, although my certainty is a bit shaken now. The other scenario was for a defeat for the revolution, was that the Sudanese people would just give up. So they would become fed up and accept a symbolic or the kind of election that happened in the region around us, and having Burhan and Hemeti as head of state and deputy, which is more or less an authoritarian rule. The third possibility was a victory for the revolution. I'm going to leave this because it has the most number of details. I'm going to jump to the fourth scenario, which is a temporary compromise. Now, this was actually how things materialized in 2019, which is a compromise between the military faction and the politicians or the civilians. It ended up with Hamdok's government, which was short-lived. And I'm sorry, I made this quite hastily, and I put the English translations, and I hope you can read them, because this was originally in Arabic. Now, the wavy square here at the bottom in red, it's wavy because I think it's open-ended. Nada promised me to give some tips on how to actually do this properly. Anyway, so this happened in 2019, which is a temporary agreement or settlement between the military faction and the civilians. And it obviously broke down in 2021 October by the coup. This was the situation back in 2019. My idea, and perhaps even my wish for the victory for the revolution, was conditioned, perhaps surprisingly to some, upon a military coup. I had no, and I still don't have, any confidence that Burhan has any interest in democracy in Sudan. He's quite keen on ruling Sudan by force. And therefore, I didn't think then, and I still don't think now, that Burhan will allow democracy. unless he had no other choice. So in order for the revolution to win, there had to be a coup within the military. If that happened, then the scenarios that would come out of this coup all involve some kind of confrontation between the RSF and the SAF. And this would, if they started fighting, then the scenarios would go either the killing or capturing of Hemeti and his family, and that would then lead to the surrender of the militias and then perhaps transition and elections. Or the fighting could happen in Khartoum, which is the scenario now. And if the military could get a quick victory, then again, we are on route to transition and elections. However, if the militia managed to defeat the SAF in Khartoum, and back in 2019, I thought that was possible. And during the 4 years since then, the RSF power in Khartoum increased multifold. So the likelihood was quite high then, and it's even higher now, that they gain control over Khartoum. And I think this is more or less the case, although not as I would have imagined. So the military still have hold and control over their bases in barracks in Khartoum. So from that, I thought that the states, other than Khartoum in Sudan, we have 18 states, so 17 states would side with the revolution and would just mobilize their forces and put siege to Khartoum until it falls. I'm not sure if that was quite realistic or wishful thinking, but I just could not imagine the scenario of the states being far from the center of Khartoum, not really threatened by the RSF, just surrendering because Khartoum fell. So I thought the confrontation between the RSF and the SAF will not end by the fall of Khartoum. And eventually, the revolution would again be victorious and en route to transition and elections. The third option or possibility in the confrontation between the RSF and the SAF was a compromise between Hemeti and Burhan, or between Hemeti, sorry, Burhan is out of the picture now. So between Hemeti and the army. And this compromise would entail that Hemeti would leave Sudan and take his forces to the private sector. So there's demand for military services in the region. And without giving too much details, I said here they can move to the UAE or Saudi Arabia, and that's mainly for the fact that they are present already in Saudi Arabia in the war in Yemen.
Ali, sorry to interrupt this very interesting point, but I just want to tell you that you have 2 to 3 minutes to.
Oh dear. Okay. So who benefits from a Dagalo dynasty? Now, in Africa, the Arabian Sahel is occupied or populated by the Arabian tribes. They would be very much interested in the model where one of their tribes gain control of a country like Sudan. And Sudan is the crown jewel of the Sahel. It has the largest population. I think it's the largest in terms of geographically speaking and economically speaking. There's also the potential for a demographic change that would take place if they win, where the Arabian tribes from the Sahel would take over in Khartoum mainly and in Central Sudan in general, not just politically, but even socially. Also, the Gulf is interested, and that's because they are interested in the ports, in the rentier economy, where they can extract resources, etc. And I think an interesting point here would be the persecution of the Islamists. It would be a possibility if Hemeti gains control of Sudan. This is the Sahel. There's no time. Who can prevent this? I think Egypt doesn't have any interest in a Dagalo dynasty. Qatar, Turkey, and the US as part, well, Qatar and Turkey as part of the competition with the other Gulf state for influence in the region, and the US doesn't want a militia rule in Sudan. Well, anywhere, they don't want the model of militia rule on countries. Popular opposition, obviously no one in Central Sudan, as we can see now, wants the RSF to rule Sudan. The Islamists, because the win of the RSF is an existential threat to them. And obviously the military, they stand in opposition to this project. For them to win, they need foreign intervention or to be able to defeat the Sudanese Armed Forces. For the SAF to win, successful siege, as I mentioned earlier, of the RSF in Khartoum, or they can call reinforcements from the states and the capturing or killing of the Dagalus, or again for intervention. There's the potential for a shaky compromise to take place, and this is due to humanitarian crisis, and it's already present in Khartoum and parts of Sudan now. So they might be pressured to sit down and negotiate a settlement. This would pretty much repeat the scenario of the Lebanon civil war and divide the country, especially Khartoum, into zones of conflict or zones of control, where the SAF would control some parts of Khartoum, the RSF would control the other, and pockets of fighting might erupt every now and then. The challenge would be for this to go ahead and end up with a permanent settlement, is to find a successful formula in which the RSF can be integrated into the SAF. And I don't think this can happen, not with the Dagalus in charge. Is civil war possible? Well, I think unless the Darfur region mainly descends into a regional kind of tribal war and civil war, this is not a possible scenario, because any reinforcements for the RSF would have to come from Darfur and from Africa, the Arabian Africa, from the Sahel. And that would just make this conflict an international, a state, interstate conflict. It's not a civil war by the strict definition of the word, which is internal conflict. Not long, Nada.
I'm sorry, I have to interrupt you here.
Okay.
So if you have any final points that you can make in like 20 seconds, now will be the time.
Okay, yeah, so this is, I think, was my final slide. The likely outcome, I think, is a victory for the SAF. And there's just not much time to explain, perhaps in the discussion. And another outcome, which I just think, according to the facts that have been happening in the past 2 months, a prolonged fight is also a possibility.
All right, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Ali.
Thank you.
You wait for the discussion time, perhaps, to make some of the points that I have interrupted you and you weren't able to do. So my next speaker is Dr. Abdeslam Said Ahmed. We're very lucky to have Dr. Abdeslam with us today. Dr. Abdeslam, are you you're able to put your camera on, right? I just saw your video. Yes, hi. So Dr. Abdeslam was in academia for quite some time. He taught and did research in both Cambridge and Durham. He also worked in the University of Windsor in Ontario. Dr. Abdeslam also spent a decade with Amnesty International as a researcher and program director for the Middle East and North Africa. And after that, he joined the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights in 2012 and worked there for 9 years. He also oversaw the establishment of the Yemen Country Office and held the position of regional representative of the High Commissioner for the MENA region. Dr. Abdeslam also worked as the senior human rights advisor to the Sudanese Prime Minister of the transitional government, Abdullah Hamdok, from 2020 to 2021. So I'm sure that he will have a very good perspective on the issues that we have already been discussing. Go ahead, Dr. Abdeslam. I'm going to time you though.
Thank you. Thank you, Nada. Good evening, everyone, and good evening, fellow panelists. I would like to thank SAWS for this opportunity, and in the short span of time, I will try to just speak rather quickly about the civilian forces in Sudan, and this may, I think we are seeing that there is a kind of a total absence of civilian voices right now, or like not really so much robust voices about what is happening. I mean, there could be a number of reasons, but in any case, my presentation today will be basically to look into the performance of the civilian forces during the December or the aftermath of the December revolution. I would like to start by pointing that what I call the Sudanese model of uprisings and civilian collisions, and that is something I think most people know that Sudan has been, since the 60s, had been through this model time and again, which is basically a civilian collision will be formed at some point, and it will lead a kind of a protest that may crystallize in a general political strike that happened in the 60s and in the 80s to overthrow military regimes. And then normally what happens after that is that soon after the success of the uprising, the civilian collision will disintegrate. Now, this wasn't a problem in the 60s and in the 80s because normally there will be a short transitional period at the end of which there will be elections and then return to parliamentary democracy. Although short-lived, I mean that was maybe a kind of a logical outcome. However, in the wake of the December revolution, the leaders of the Freedom and Force, Freedom and Change coalition, sought maybe to go a different path, which is to have a longer transitional period in order to achieve or a kind of be able to do the arrangements that would have a kind of a more sustainable democratic transformation. But as we know, this happened through a kind of a troubled civilian-military partnership that maybe, as we know, did not really allow the situation, to reach its logical conclusion. But in any case, I would like to speak basically on 3 points regarding the performance of the civilian forces, which is the first regarding the it relates to what I call inadequate platforms and processes and tools. The second about lack of unity and vision among the and objectives among the civilian actors. And the third will be, we will speak about the troubled relationship, civilian-military relationship. Now, as I said, what happened in the past was that soon after the success of the uprising, the civilian coalition will disintegrate. This also happened in a way, despite the longer transitional period, happened in a way after the success of the December uprising. The FFC soon disintegrated, actually, or at least differences emerged, and some forces left, and maybe by 2020, it was no longer the grand collision that led the December uprising. And then, you know what, this opened the, you know, questions about, you know, really to what extent this formula is a good one, that is to success in overthrowing military, or at least forcing kind of, if you like, a rapprochement or an agreement that the military, or at least segment of the military, will side with the revolution, and then the coalition will fail to build sustainable democratic system. Now, as we know, it is normally the case that there will be a broad agreement, what is called a kind of a minimum level agreement, that is bound by, you know, overthrowing or at least rejecting the authoritarian regime. But then there will be disagreements on everything else. Now, what is the I mean, if we look at the components of the FFC, we have the political parties, we have these what I call the civic alliances, which is the professional associations, civic forces like civil society organizations, and then resistance committees indirectly were represented somehow, or at least they were a force that formed a kind of a strong constituency. Now, this these three components. Then, when I come to the issue of lack of unity in vision and approach, I will speak on a couple of issues. One has to do with the structural issues. The other has to do with the agency of these different components. If we take the political parties, and a lot has happened. Basically, the impact of a 30-year authoritarian regime or rule has left its impact on the on the political parties. You have factionalism, you have problems of leadership, you have kind of an eroding constituencies. And if you take, for example, the UMA and DUP, this was definitely evident. There are no longer the parties that continue to form governments in the various democratic episodes in the history of Sudan since independence. I think the problem with the political parties, it goes beyond the political party in question. It has to do with the lack of a political. It impacted on a lack of political leadership for the transitional period, and that is quite a dangerous thing, in my opinion. Unlike the 60s and the 80s, after December, in the from 2019 until the coup of, or even until now, there wasn't really a coherent political leadership of the civilian forces, and that is a big gap. Now, the main issue here is that if you do not have elected structures, parliament, etc., and then you need a kind of a broad agreement among the civilian forces in order to steer, the path towards a democratic transformation, and that wasn't happening. There are, as I said, there are different divergent views about how do we see the future of Sudan, etc. Now, so there were objective problems that impacted on the political parties. There wasn't an elected trade union movement after 2019. Only recently there were attempts to get, and I think this is not just an issue of lack of will. It has something to do with the deep economic and demographic changes that affected Sudanese society during the last 3 decades, and that may explain partially the lack of elected trade union movement, particularly if you take workers and farmers, for example, which used to be the backbone of the trade union movement in Sudan. But if even professional bodies could have formed elected trade union movement in the period from after 2019 until 2021, they could have had elected bodies for the trade union movement throughout, but it didn't happen. I think either for lack of will or subjective reasons. So then you have other problems affecting, the civilian forces. The high expectations from the public at large, particularly the young people who led the revolution, from the transitional government. As I said, there was a lack of united vision after the revolution, after the success and the formation of the transitional government among the FFC forces. All this led to weakening, the impact of the civilian forces. Now, with these weaknesses, so we have actually individual weaknesses for the three components. And I think it is in place to speak a little bit about the resistance committees. Now, the resistance committees, they were there not really in the same organized manner that emerged later on, but during the revolution and during the period until 2019, the networks were there, but the structure of the committees came into existence gradually, I think, after the success and after the formation of the transitional government. Then you started to have a kind of a more structured resistance committee, and that may explain why the resistance committees emerged in prominence after the coup of October 25th. At the same time, we see the disintegration of the professional association at that time for political differences, or due to political differences. So now the resistance committees remain the strongest component in terms of the impact and in terms of the ability to mobilize. But again, they continue to suffer the same problem, is that they were not able to have a kind of a sizable input in terms of how to build sustainable democracy in Sudan. And maybe that is something that may come in the future, but we don't know. Excuse me, just a second.
Dr. Abdeslam, I'm going to take this opportunity and remind you of the time.
Yes, I will be finished.
2 to 3 minutes, yes?
Yes, okay. Now, so basically, we have weaknesses and problems in the three components of the civilian coalition. Political parties, I haven't spoken about the civil society, but I think the problem about civil society is a kind of rotation between, political activism and, the kind of activism that the civil society organization were set for, which is either to work in charity or human rights or development, etc. But this is not Sudan issue only. In times like, what happened and under authoritarian regime and this kind of thing, there is always a political dimension in one way or the other, and it becomes more pronounced during the uprising. So the civil society also they suffer different issues that we can't really enlist right now. But in any case, we know that the Civic Alliance withdrew from FFC at some point, as it happened in other forces. So the various components of the Civic Alliance had of the FFC had their problem. Now, with these problems combined, then the civilian forces had to deal with the military partnership between 2019 2021. You had the transitional government of Dr. Hamdouk, which is trying to mediate or trying to negotiate, if you like, a relationship with the FFC on the one hand, with the military on the other hand, and at the same time manage the country. And that was, I think, a kind of a very complex task that is very difficult to steer clear in such a dynamic. So basically, the civilian forces were ill-equipped, in my opinion, to stand up to the designs of the military component. And as Dr. Ali before me spoke, the designs of the military component were clear, which is basically to preserve their accumulated wealth gains and privileges, bend to the storm with minimum changes. That is the bend to the demands of the December Revolution, claiming that they have cited it, and then strike at the right moment, which they did during the coup of 25th October. So basically, this kind of the civilian component was not able to foil the coup, even though resistance continued until the outbreak of the conflict, or until there were a kind of a new negotiation to resume a political process. I think I should stop here, and thank you very much for. I hope I presented something coherent. Yeah.
Thank you very much. And talking of civilian forces, our next speaker is Dr. Hussam Eddin Ismail, who is currently in Omdurman. And Dr. Hussam is an active member of the resistance committees. Dr. Hussam is a Sudan-based strategist and econometrician, and he has contributed to the first National Economic Conference. He is also a member of the Economic Coalition of the December Revolution. So without further ado, Hussam, are you able to have your mic on? Yes, can we try?
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for having me.
That's all right.
I'll try my best to
So we will have to bear with the
be as concise as possible.
Yeah, Hussam, before you start, I just want to make sure that you're fine and all this stuff. But yeah, go ahead. And we will bear with the network issues. Don't worry about it.
I'm fine. I'm fine. I will be very concise, taking precautions from the siege situation that we are experiencing in Old Omdurman day and night by Janjaweed forces.
Understandable. Go ahead, Hussam.
Okay. I have a few points to highlight, and I think these points have been very popular for those who are interested in the political landscape of Sudan in the recent 4 years. I'm going to tell the narrative, if I may say, the narrative of the resistance committees, basing on our experience in the last 4 years, basing on in our contribution to the revolution, and recently to the revolutionary charter that resistance committees have issued recently, or 6 to 7 months back. Actually, I think there is a consensus that there is a status of political fragmentation And variant perspectives are there describing the reasoning behind this fragmentation. Why did it happen? When did it happen? What had to be done in order to prevent this fragmentation from happening mid-2020. And I think we started altogether good. Early 2019, the coalition of FFC successfully gathered those who are against the extremist Islamist who destroyed Sudan in the last 30 years, like 34 years after that. But I think the urge of FFC to seize the power prematurely was the major reason of this fragmentation. Okay, things were not ready, were not in normal pace, were not in normal situation. We needed to stay longer together in order to combat the Islamists, in order to eradicate them properly from the state, before we urge all of us, FFC, resistance committees, all the revolutionary forces, before we seize the power. And I think this urge to power, premature urge to power, was the major reason of this defragmentation. We started 89 bodies and parties in January 2019, ended by 4 parties 1.5 years later, late 2020. And I think this fragmentation or this reduction in the revolutionary force or momentum allowed the counter-revolutionary forces to infiltrate inside the revolution and to play their counter tactics and strategies to dismantle or to weaken the revolution. And next to that is, I think, the contradiction that our government, our transition government, implemented or tried or showed between the modus Dr. Hamidok was telling at the beginning of the formation of the first transition government, and the way he started to implement this modus. I think this gap also led to more defragmentation. The political agenda of the revolution totally were deviated from practically by the implementation of IMF/World Bank policies, without taking any precautionary measures or parallel measures in order to prevent, in order to encounter the consequences of this policies. The issue of the transitional justice that was diluted in order to appease the junta or to appease the defunct regime. The handover by Dr. Hamidok's government of peace profile or to the military, to the junta, the handover of the international affairs issue or file to the junta as well. All these blunders led to more defragmentation that split resistance committees gradually from their incubator, which is the FFC, and led also to more cleavage, to deepen the cleavage inside FFC, ending by 4 parties instead of 89 parties, 1.5 years earlier than the end of 2020. The exacerbation of the economic status also helped to reduce the popularity of the transitional government. And here I'm talking practically about those who suffered from the shock that Dr. Badawi and his team, his cabinet, made in the Sudanese community, and plus to the effect of COVID-19 and the other consequences, actually the failure of the international community to support thoroughly that shock with bilateral or multilateral funding. All these factors together helped reduce the popularity of the transitional government, and opened wide the door for the Islamist and the counter-revolution regionally and inside Sudan to deter the advancement of the revolution. Not the least, I think the promises of the international community led by the United States in supporting the transition government also were not or did not help actually in supporting that transition. In any situation, fragile situation like Sudan, post-revolutionary, supporting development, reducing poverty, helping in employment, helping in balancing the budgetary deficit, etc. All this package would have helped a lot if the West was generous enough, especially after implementing seriously implementing all the requirements and compliances that IMF, World Bank asked from the government. The subsidization of fuel and electricity, unification of forex, starting privatization, etc. All this package that seriously Dr. Hamidou's government implemented thoroughly did not help actually, or was not convincing enough for the US, United States especially, to support the Sudanese people and to support the transition. And clearly, after the coup of 25th October, we expected that United States or the Security Council or the international community officially condemn that coup or inflict any sort of sanctions against those who perpetuated this coup, whether the army or RSF. But unfortunately, nothing happened compared to what the Security Council did against some coup in West of Africa. I think the Guinean coup d'etat. I think after 10 days of that coup, sanctions were imposed on the perpetrators of the junta of that country. Up to this moment, up to 15th April, nothing happened against those who committed the coup d'etat of 25th October. And practically, there is no clue, actually, that United States is serious about helping Sudanese people in having a civilian-led government, practically. And I think, from my perspective, from the Resistance Committee's perspective, that the military is the right body that can normalize with Israel, that can be inclined to Western policies, not to be independent in terms of implementing a balanced economic strategy that builds a real economy, that productive economy that can be independent in terms of its relation with China, India, Brazil, or to establish some sort of South-South cooperation or so. United States wants a government that is submissive, that can deter or prevent the intervention of China and Russia into Africa. And that cannot happen if a real revolutionary government is established. And I think in a meeting we held with Godfrey, the American ambassador, he was serious enough. There is a record of that meeting popular in the social media. He was clear cut about that. The army should be there in the sea, and that statement contradicted with all the statements Volker Perthes, Godfrey, and all the utilities that had been trying to appease the congestion between the military and the civilian forces. These contradictions, in my belief, were all the time telling us that United States is not that serious in terms of political support, nor economic support to the revolution that United States wants to have a promising country in place. And altogether, all these factors together, I think, besides the mistakes of Al-Burhan in supporting RSF in the recent 4 years, the last 4 years, not to mention preliminary, the role of the Islamist, defunct Islamist government in building RSF, led to the situation that we are living in right now, the war of 15th April. And in my belief that nothing could be restored unless we all together work together. And we relinquished for a while our urge to seize the power, to work together, FFC, resistance committees, SPA, all the agents that are contributing to the political landscape in Sudan, to work again together, to go back to the 1st of January 2019 step, and to work together from the beginning, condemning the atrocities RSF is committing right now in Khartoum and in Geneva and all Darfur, agreeing on certain measures that were discussed from our perspective in the resistance committees in our charter. I think there is an English version that's popular. Maybe Dr. Nada can disseminate for the respected audience. All these solutions or measures could help in a way or in another to restore the civilian transition, support the civilian, and to accelerate going back to this state in which we can build a great country for all of us. Thanks.
Thank you, Hussam. Thank you also for keeping time. And yes, indeed, I have access to the English translation that Hussam sent me today of Al-Mithaq al-Thawri, which is, so the Revolutionary Declaration. Okay, so I think it's a really good point now to bring in Professor Khalid Madani. Khalid is an associate professor of political science and Islamic studies and the chair of the African Studies program at McGill University. Khalid has a PhD in political science from the University of California, Berkeley, and he has published widely on the roots of the civil conflict and the political economy of Islamist activism in Sudan. He has also recently focused on the role of youth activism and democratization, and is working on a book manuscript on the prospects and challenges of democracy in Sudan. So Khalid, I'll give you the floor, go ahead. But again, I'm timing you.
I know you will. Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm going to, first of all, I want to thank SOAS and Dr. Nada, and it is a real honor to be with everyone, both Dr. Ali and Dr. Abdel Salam, and also just a special hello to Hussam in Durman. I feel more as a discussant rather than a presenter because all my colleagues covered so much ground and all of the important points. And so I'm going to keep my remarks succinct. And I know that there are many people who have joined us who have a great deal of knowledge in terms of what is going on currently. I was tasked with discussing the Sudanese revolution of 2018-2019 in the context of other revolutions, the obstacles to democratization in Sudan, and the potential scenarios which Dr. Ali covered so expertly. So I'm going to just briefly cover that. And importantly, also with respect to my research with youth activism in Sudan since at least 2010, the notion or understanding or our understanding of how youth activists in Sudan have learned from not only experiences of other countries, but also the history of the cycle of protest in Sudan. It is small comfort to say, for me to begin and say, in terms of the research on democratization, most research now is focused on democratic reversals and authoritarian persistence, democratic decay. I say that because despite the brutal violence ongoing, there is no question that the majority of Sudanese still are, from my perspective, and I'm sure my colleagues as well, are insistent on the transition to democracy, as Hussam put it so well. The goals of revolutions, in other words, continue. And I think that that is really important. So I did want to talk about both the obstacles to democratization in Sudan in the context of the revolution, but also perhaps maybe the prospects. As a takeaway, and I know I don't have too much time, I would argue that, as Hussam, I think, did so well, that the present conflict really is a war not only against the Sudanese people, but related to that, a war against, number one, democracy and the success of the revolution, and number two, a war against accountability. For all the discussion about the issue of security sector reform, which is so central, I think Hussam reminded us that there were two elements that are central to the revolution and also are central to why we have gotten here in Sudan. And that is the absence of accountability and the evasion of it on the part of both generals and the issue of democracy. The sheer success of the revolution in Sudan is one of the main reasons why we see such brutality. The history post-revolution, I'm going to try to be succinct and summarize, has been what we call a process of trying to upgrade authoritarianism, trying to return to Sudan to another military dictatorship. From the very beginning, whether it's the coalition government of August 2019, whether it was the Juba agreement that Burhan and of course the Sudanese Armed Forces leadership tried to and did effectively sideline the civilian coalition, at the behest and cooperation of Hamdok, the prime minister at the time. If it's the coup of October 21, which was also a way to try to forestall the democratic forces and the revolution. And of course, the framework agreement itself, which was from the very beginning designed not to transition to Sudan to a civilian democracy, but rather to what we call upgrade authoritarianism, return Sudan once again to the authoritarian military dictatorship that has historically been led by the National Congress Party and its remnants. So rather than talk about all of the details, I thought I would just highlight maybe four elements that are important for our understanding both the obstacles to the revolution in going forward or being reinvigorated, more directly the potential in the future for a transition, a return to a transition to democracy, and also, of course, the prospects. And those four factors, I think, from the other context that we know of, and this is why Dr. Neda asked me to talk about Sudan in the context of other countries. And here I would refer to what we call the thesis of authoritarian persistence. One thing that is really important, I think, that we don't discuss enough, Dr. Said Ahmed spoke of so well about the problems and divisions within civil society in Sudan. But what is happening in Sudan is also the failure of the military establishment to actually monopolize complete control of the country, leading to this particular kind of war. I know that it is counterintuitive to say it is actually the failure on the part of the military to establish the kind of stability, let's say, the Egyptian regime did, and even Tunisia ongoing at the moment, and other countries that have undergone popular protest. It is really a result of the failure of the partnership between Hemeti Dagalo and Burhan that has led to this kind of war. And I think all of you are aware that it is really the failure to actually be able to establish a government to begin with that has precipitated this war. The four elements that I think are worthy of discussion, I'll go over them quickly, is the fiscal capacity of the state and the extent to which the regime in Sudan is able to generate the kind of resources that allowed it or had allowed it in the past under Bashir to have loyal clients to support the regime. That has been increasingly absent, leading increasingly to the lack of legitimacy and constituency on the part of the leadership of the Sudan Armed Forces. The other aspect is something that Dr. Said Ahmed spoke about in detail, and Hussam, of course, really also emphasized, and that is whether it is the obstacle or the prospect for democratization. It is really the level of coordination and cohesion that was built up during the course of the revolution that helps us understand the obstacles to democratization, but also the potential prospects. To what extent can the resistance committees return to that coordination and cohesiveness in conjunction with other civil organizations? That remains the question in terms of understanding the prospect for democratization. Another aspect, and I can't go into detail because I think the discussion will emphasize that, is the level of external support, not only regionally, but externally, vis-a-vis these two generals, these two actors that we're talking about. And crucially, of course, we return to the issue of what we call the security, the autonomy of the security apparatus, the extent to which we have this division between Burhan and Hemeti, that is the leadership of the Sudan Armed Forces and the Rapid Support Forces, which is really important. I think that if I was to emphasize two things, one of them is to quickly talk about the obstacles that we should keep in mind, and then talk about the prospects in the context of the success of the revolution in Sudan. The obstacles really can be encapsulated, I know I don't have any time, in what we call, not only in Sudan, but elsewhere, the deep state. What the Sudanese revolution is coming up against, and the Sudanese population more generally, is 30 years of the elaborate construction of a deep state. In the context of the Islamist, of course, National Congress Party at the time, many of you are familiar with all of the pillars of Temkeen and empowerment, not only in terms of the issue of purging the bureaucracy and establishing an Islamist bureaucracy as such, but also, very importantly, two things: the increasing control of large swaths of both the public and private sector, which is something really important. And this is why I began these remarks by saying it's a conflict not only for accountability and justice, which is central, but also this is a war against the issue of the kind of deep state and the vestiges of the deep state that were built up for 30 years, and the interest of both the leadership of the Sudan Armed Forces and Hemeti himself, the Dagalo brothers. Both of them have a vested interest, of course, in the deep state and preserving the economic wealth that they amassed through illicit and violent means. And of course, the legacy, most importantly, I don't have to repeat it here, the legacy really of the factionalization of the Sudan Armed Forces in order to weaken the national army and expand it, or rather factionalize it, into first the Popular Defense Forces, and of course the Janjaweed and the Rapid Support Forces, but also the Shadow Brigade, Kataib al-Zil as well. This was a strategy to forestall not only insurgency in Darfur, but I think all of us know this is really the strategy that was implemented in order to prevent any popular revolution that had been kind of witnessed in the past in Sudan. The second point of emphasis here are the prospects. If the obstacles here are the deep state in a larger sense in terms of the majority of Sudanese population, then the prospects lie in, I know we don't talk about it enough these days, and that is the ingredients of the success of the Sudanese revolution itself. And it's really important, just quickly, I should conclude with this, that the cycles of protest that began in Sudan, at least since 2010, 2011, really established a number of elements among Sudanese activists that made Sudan very different from its counterparts. And here I return to that theme of the success of the revolution is unfortunately, one of the main reasons why we have this war. And that had to do with the ingenious, I would argue, way in which Sudanese activists, like their counterparts in other countries, established horizontal networks to allow ease of entry of young people in order to mobilize very quickly. And of course, the second aspect of these horizontal networks that the resistance committees, of course, established so well throughout the country also was to evade the might of the coercive apparatus in a particular kind of way, which becomes really important. The cross-regional and ethnic and even racial unity and cohesion was really born out of a great deal of work. I'm not going to repeat or try to educate people like Hussam, but there are a number of elements. The work, Adab al-Sawra, the work of the literature and the repertoires of contention, the real, tireless work put in to unite the Sudanese population across ethnicity was extremely important. It was, of course, aided by the deep, deep economic crisis that hit not only the rural areas, but the urban areas. But nevertheless, we forget that the work, the ideational work, becomes really important. So to conclude in terms of the success of the revolution in the context of others that were not as successful in this particular time period, were these horizontal networks that were so important in combating the coercive apparatus of the state. But in the case of Sudan, and this is why Dr. Sid Ahmed's remarks are so important, it, in the context of the revolution, was aided and became successful because of the linkage between those horizontal networks and also the Sudanese professional associations, the vertical networks, and even, despite begrudgingly, youth activists and the resistance committees that did, for a moment at least, ally with the political parties. We know in the literature on democratization that there is no substitute for a transition to democracy without this kind of combination of horizontal networks and vertical networks in civil society in order to find that strength and coherence that can underpin a democratic transition. There was another thing and that was really important, and that is the notion or the issue of external support. How was it that despite the counter-revolutionary forces that were so effective elsewhere, that in the context of Sudan, they were not, at least during the revolutionary period, not as successful? I would say that had to do not only with shifting regional interest, but first and foremost, of course, the consistent, sustained revolutionary force and organization of Sudanese across the civil society. But I would also say there was an agency part that from the point of view and work of the resistance committees, the SPNA and others, there was what I call the delegitimization and a counter-hegemonic discourse. A counter-hegemonic discourse that was able to really critique very, very strongly and very persuasively the so-called Islamist regime that is separating the Islamism from our religion, which became so effective in terms of really popularizing the revolution, but also convincing in this particular period that the interest of regional and international actors in the potential of a transition to democracy would actually be feasible. And here is where I want to just conclude with the final concluding remark, because I was asked to talk about potential scenarios. Dr. Ali said and really outlined them. One, of course, is the outright military victory of one party over another. Historically in Africa, it usually occurs in terms of what we call a mutually hurting stalemate. In other words, in a situation where both parties are unable to establish an outright military victory. In those situations, in the context of other experiences, and I know that I have to conclude, I wanted to say that the issue of intervention negotiation, of course, occurs, whether it was in Sierra Leone or Liberia. But I want to conclude with what has to do with the issue of the revolution itself. And that is, in all cases, in post-conflict setting, and we must, of course, look to the future, no matter what we are seeing now, in the other African countries, and this is where we must learn from our continent and not only other regions, that the inclusion of civil society groups has been essential. If you track the initial failure in Liberia in the late 1990s, and then the relatively successful negotiations that occurred in 2003, you'll find that the end of the civil war, the brutal civil war in Liberia, and the transition to democratization in Liberia, despite its problems there, had very much to do with one single ingredient, and that is the inclusion of stakeholders in civil society and not just representatives of military factions and forces. I want to conclude there because I think that in looking at the future, we must understand the real success and the legacy and the endurance of the revolution itself, even as we start thinking about resolution to the conflict and a return to a transition to civilian democracy in the future. Did I go over?
No, well, just a little bit, just a minute, it's fine.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. The reason I have not interrupted you is because this is obviously a very good drawing together of the threads of all the talking points of our speakers. So thank you very much, Professor Khaled. I just want to make a remark about the seminar because even though the time on Zoom says it will end at 7:30, we are actually not going to be kicked out of the room. So if you're able to stay, that would be great. I will start by asking perhaps one question. The reason I'm going to do this is in the interest of time so that we can get to the questions from the audience. And I think my question, as audience, you can also raise your hand, I'm told by the organizer, to ask a question, to speak it into the mic. So please use the functionality if you can. The question that I have, and it's arising out of all the talking points, is about the fragmentation between civilian forces. This is obviously one of the factors that perhaps led to the situation where we're in today, but it's also a point that is seems to be made by the international community in relation to searching for a solution to the conflict. And perhaps it's an important point to emphasize in order to prevent a division of Sudan, basically, into the Lebanese scenario that Ali talked about. So I think my question to all of you as panelists is how much are civilian forces not agreeing on, and what are the prospects, or how can we go back to the cohesion of 2019? And also, how does this lack of unity affect the policies of the international community in relation to Sudan? So I am happy for all of you to pick any of these points to talk about. And maybe Hussam talked a little bit about the revolutionary declaration, Mithaq al-Thawri, and maybe I can start with him. Hussam, do you want to say a little bit about this?
Actually, in the last 4 years, we have talked a lot. We have talked a lot, prophesizing about the future and the future of Sudan, if and only if we work together. And I'm tending to be very concise and brief about talking when it comes to the what to do, because the what to do theoretically is obvious for everyone. In a room, everyone can theoretically can agree on a framework. But practically, we have been confronting many hindrances that I'm talking about us as civilian forces, many hindrances that prevented from materializing the objectives of December Revolution. And these hindrances, unfortunately, has nothing to do with the mental capabilities or the knowledge of Sudanese history or about the willingness of being good and patriots, real patriots, but about how to prevent ourselves from urging to power. And I think FFC, this is the major symptom that FFC is suffering from. The premature urge to power, to political power, seizure of power, when we are not all of us ready in terms of vision and tactics to handle this defragmented country by the Islamists. So in the Revolutionary Charter, we diagnosed the problems, historical problem of Sudan, anatomize it, and presented solution. Briefing you about almost 50 pages in this short gathering is not practical. But I think most of us went through that charter in a way or another. Maybe not all of us were interested in reading this production of December Revolution Youth, but I'm inviting you to read that charter. It does not differ a lot from the constitution of the lawyers or the al-ittifaq al-itari, the framework agreement, if I translate it right. It does not. But the mechanism of implementing the objectives of the charter differ a lot from that of the politician of FFC, from SPA, and from the variant agents of the December Revolution. The resistance committees are adhered to principles. This is the major difference between us and FFC. We adhere to principles. Politicians adhere to tactics. They don't have principles. They have tactics, flaccid and floating tactics that differ by time in order to reach their objective, which is power. But in resistance committees, we see that these tactics, or the time of these tactics, has not come yet. We have to adhere to principles. Even if these principles delayed the seizure of power in the way political parties see the traditional way, which is having 2 or 3 ministers in a transitional government, or having some staff here and there in offices, or near Hamadok or so. And that's the main default FFC fall into in the last 4 years, and they are still insisting to fall into.
Yeah, Hussam, I think this is a really good point that you made. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of return the question to Dr. Abdussalam and ask him, given this lack of agreement regarding processes or mechanisms for implementation, how does this affect the international community's approach to particular issues in Sudan, or to the implementation of the goals of the revolutionary charters or whatever? So basically, my question is like, how is this lack of unity read by
Sorry, I was about to speak, but I thought that somebody else was still speaking. But anyway, yes, I think it has affected. Just to clarify my personal opinion, I think is what I mentioned earlier, that the lack of political leadership. Now it is very difficult really to reach a consensus or a common agreement, even though I agree with Hussam that there is no differences with regard to the content, but there are differences with regard to processes and mechanisms, etc. This is in my opinion, there is a problem of legitimacy. If you don't have elected bodies like as we used to have trade unions, or if you don't have a strong political leadership represented in parties with established constituencies, which used to be the case a few decades ago, then you have a problem of legitimacy, and then nobody is really ready to agree with anybody because they don't see them better. Now, the resistance committees is a new phenomena, and it is something that is broad-based. But as I said, it is still very good in mobilization, but in terms of providing leadership, for the country at large, there is still discussion about that. But yeah, back to the question about the international community. Yes, it is affecting. It is something that became prevalent after the coup of October 25th, that you see the mediators from the African Union to others saying that we can't really deal with 30 initiatives and different forces and this kind of thing. So that is something that is affecting the unity of a civilian voice is affecting. I'm sorry, I lost my voice here, but yeah, it is affecting. I think so here.
Yeah, I think the idea is very clear. Khalid, do you want to come in and maybe with perhaps explaining whether there is any prospect for future unity between civilian forces in Sudan, how to achieve this?
Well, I don't know if there's an option. That is really important. I did, we have read all of us, I think, read the charter, and I agree that there's no substantive difference between the charter and the others as well. And I think Hussam put it so well that there are different, principles versus tactics and all of that. But the reason that I spoke in the context of other examples, I do feel, first of all, it's important to have this conversation. We've had it, and I've always been really concerned about Sudan dialogue, because that is a recipe for disaster. Instead, we have to also learn from what we really want. Is there a consensus over civilian democracy? If that is, if there is, I'm not sure, but I believe there is, then at the same time, we can then begin talking about the processes and mechanisms, which I think is really important. But I will maintain, I think I'm glad Hussam said that the charter is not that different, which basically means there is a consensus. There isn't everyone, of course, and it's understandable. Political parties are very self-interested. We don't want to go into all of the details and betrayals of the different political parties, because that's something that happens globally. What does happen in Africa, and since the 1990s, the majority of African countries have transitioned to constitutional democracies, despite a lot of different problems. We want to learn from that. That has been a combination of grassroots mobilization, linking up with political parties. And from there, of course, you have regulations for political party laws. And of course, the charter also sets out a really effective way of representation in parliament in the transitional period. That is very important, given the brutal state of a country falling apart completely. I think that, and I hate to say this, but I think that now there is an opportunity to have this discussion all over again, because the FFC is no longer relevant. Let's face it, and the whole country is now being torn apart. It is in these awful moments that there are opportunities where people actually do come together in working out processes to a transition. That's my perspective. people can differ, but this is what I
Thank you. Ali, do you have anything to say about that? I mean, I think one of the points that emerge from this is that perhaps we can all agree that the RSF has an indefensible position. So, you know, this is not a point for contention at all. But then what do we do about the army afterwards?
Well, let me just say, to continue from the point Professor Madani raised, he asked the question whether there's a consensus about democracy in Sudan. And he was slightly hesitating politely there.
Yes.
But my answer, I think I'll be a bit more bold, is that I don't think there is. Politicians in Sudan seem to hold upon ideologies more than the the countries in which these ideologies actually originated. So we divide ourselves into left and right, and I don't think the Sudanese society and history, even culture, really accommodates this kind of division. But we hold to it very tight and give it priority over democracy, whether that comes from the radical left or the radical right. They seem to have consensus in prioritizing rule and reaching power over agreeing to democracy. So coming back to your point, obviously I agree the RSF position is indefensible, but whatever the army does, I think they need to, resolve the situation, even if it means that they share in the power. And I actually wrote an article saying that the solution, the road ahead for Sudan, in the context of what's going on the ground for the past 4 years, might be that there is no path to democracy without the military being involved. And I've had just a few glimpses from Professor Madani's paper that you shared, and I think there's some literature on that kind of gradual progress towards democracy in which the military is accommodated in power.
Okay. I think what I'm going to be doing now is to open the floor for questions, and I'll ask Rana to read out the questions from the chat, if that's okay, Rana?
Yeah. So just to let you know, we have about 9 questions and 3 hands. So should we alternate? Should I read the first question?
I'm pretty sure one of the questions was about the civilian fragmentation, so just keep an eye out on it. So yeah, read the question. Yeah, half is fine. Yeah.
Let's go for it. And I'll read them in order, just that's fair. So this is from Isam Huma. Forgive me if I butchered your name. And he asked, what is the chance for grassroots local governments in Khartoum and the rest of the country to order both the Rapid Support Forces and Sudanese Armed Forces to end this war, as none of them have any claim to legitimacy, but for their brute force? The second question, so I'll do 2 at a time. The second question is from Anonymous. He says, or she says, one of the most disturbing things in Sudan is that the professional organization that had a very objective agenda and was able to gather people around it suddenly reverted to different political alliances. At the start, however, whoever was leading it then had a visionary and new way of approaching the problems in Sudan. At some point, however, this was completely lost. I sometimes wonder if it somehow was led by specific people rather than being a true representative of a larger group who are aligned with political groups, which are a huge part of the problem in Sudan. No group in Sudan stepped away from the politics and considered the humanitarian condition of the country. The Sudan Professional Association had this approach and lost it, sadly. My question is, how do we break away from these cycles of violence and toxic politics? So I'll stop here and then.
Yeah. So the questions are open for any of the panelists. So if you want to have a go at it.
Perhaps Hussam can answer the first. In terms of the second, was the question the second one on the Sudanese Professional Association?
I think the question was generally about breaking away from cycles of violence and toxic politics in which the civilian forces tend to come together on some issues and then fragment over polarized politics. That's what I understood from the question.
Yeah, it's very strange for me to say this, but there is in these kind of questions, there is an overemphasis on the critique on civil society and less analysis on the military. One of the reasons that I gave that history that everyone knows about the deep state is to understand the kind of very hard work that was done on the part of the military establishment in order to tip the balance as against civil society. We're talking here about divisions within civil society as if civil societies are the largest influence in the balance of power. Absolutely, we should talk about state civil society, military civil society relations, but we should do it in the context of understanding the balance. And the balance is overwhelmingly on the side of the military. Understanding that is really important. There is no question that political parties and individuals are self-interested and have played, as an example, there's no question that with Dagalo and there was a tacit agreement among him and the FFC, as all of you know, to actually defer the issue of accountability and justice, right? We know that that was kind of, the deal that was brokered. Does that mean that that civil society group is stronger than the military? Does that mean that, we should not analyze I tried to recite at the beginning from August 2019, the particular policies the military put through in order to undermine the revolution. We must go back to understanding the specificities of that. Now, that doesn't mean, and Dr. Ali, I agree, of course, no country can survive with a national standing army. And that's why the resistance committees in their charter are very clear about the issue of security sector reform. And they outline it very effectively, even better than the United Nations did. But let's really go back and focus on who really is tipping the balance, as against the civilian bloc. We can dispute and argue about the ideological divisions, ethnic and political in civil society all day long, but who is destroying the capital city of Khartoum and the entire country? Is it civil society in Sudan? I don't think so.
Understood. Hussam, do you want to tackle the question regarding the grassroots local governments?
Yeah, that's a major demand or a major solution presented by the Revolutionary Charter. Yes, the Revolutionary Charter is grassroots oriented. And I'm going to be very brief about that. We are pro for any grassroots solution. We are against any elite kidnapping solution that forges the will of the Sudanese people. That has been the tactic of FFC in the previous 4 years. Only 4 parties allege their representation to the Sudanese revolution, and that's not totally true. And I agree with the gentleman who accentuated the role of the grassrootism between practice in establishing a solid platform for a transitional government. Yeah, please refer to the Revolution Charter, English or Arabic version, that's available by Dr. Nada. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Rana, do you want to allow some of the attendees to ask their own questions?
Yes, so I'll go in order of the list that I have here. So we'll start with Ustaz Ahmed bin Nega. I will allow you to speak and you should be able to unmute yourself.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for having me. I'm a practicing lawyer in Sudan, and I would like to comment that throughout the discussion, we consider that the current war as something that we can overcome easily, and that the RSF is just targeting Sudan as a state. But it comes with a larger principle, and we can see that by them being attacking Al-Ubayd, Khartoum, Niala, Fashir, Al-Junaina, Darfur. And it seems to be that they have a plan B and a plan C for rather a larger division or larger fight that coming if they fail in Khartoum. Just a minute ago, their spokesperson is speaking live from Khartoum to Al Jazeera, and that's a televised service. It seems to be that they have hold the place while the military itself cannot do that for the time being. I'm not questioning the power of the military, but I believe we have to understand that the failure of the military or any form of defeat or reconciliation with the RSF will lead to seeing a country not Sudan, because that would lead to another fragmented society. What is happening in Khartoum not presented, and that is a major issue. The discussion also talk about democratization and the as Dr. Hussam speak, another charter being in, or a document starting from 2019, like Sudan actually existed at that date. And the idea of the revolution is only targeting the 30 years of what can be seen as Sudan history. Since the existence of Sudan as an independent state, we have been in a civil war and a democratic period, short-lived as everybody believed, and then an authoritarian regime, and that keep repeating. And we are doing the same thing now. And I don't think that anybody anticipated this in 2019. Sudan doesn't have a valid institutions, and only self-centered leaders who lead the institution to whatever happened. The military understand what the RSF are doing for the last 4 years, is just waiting this to happen. Nobody can explain that but a self-centered decision by the leader, Al-Burhan. Will we be seeing Al-Burhan after that? Will we be seeing a military acting the same way after the war ends? We don't know. But a new leader will come in and maybe we see a different mechanism happening. The party and the civil society also self-centered. Everybody wants to govern. Nobody talk about election. When it comes to election, it's always 2-3 years. They need gap. They need to process. It's only the tactics of killing the competition. Nothing more than that, as far as I can see in the last 4 years, and the last 30 years, and the last 60 years. So the question is when we are going to ask the people what they want. There is no valid constitution. The last long constitution lived is 2005, and that led to the separation of the country. And that was not part of any form of asking the communities about their decision. The people who live in the remote areas, the South Kordofan, the Blue Nile, the Nuba Mountains, still have a different say. Darfur in itself has a different say. That society, these societies were not consulted for any form of political change. Even their leaders now are only self-centered about how to govern. We do not see them engaging in this war or saying anything but to be neutralized. To some extent, I don't know where they're going to engage, where their people are being killed, the way that we have seen in Geneva and in other places. And I don't think that will stop. Due to the failure of state.
I was wondering whether the 2019 revolution was actually a referendum that has been contributed to by all parts of Sudan, because the revolution was not just in Khartoum.
Well, I believe, I understand that it was also done by the all political parties, everybody in the Sudan, everybody engaged into that. But I see people fighting in Kassala, Gadarif, Port Sudan during the 4 years for just tribal conflict, ethnic dispute that we never had in Blue Nile. During these governments, whether Hamdok period or Burhan period or Hamiti period, this shows that people doesn't believe in the state as a constitutional framework to live in, and rather tribal leaders are leading the path. When we are going to engage this community where we can stop that, because all the problems now coming from the periphery of the state, not from the center of the state, because that feel of not being included into the process, that the tribal, the Sufis, even the Islamists is a really big part of that. And yet we're still hearing the argument that the Islamists should be excluded after the war. Well, they have been excluded before the war for 4 years, and we haven't seen any success to that effect. The Islamists also saying that the SSF should not be part of the discussion as well. So when it comes to have that inclusion, and when it should be considered as Sudan as communities coming together in this largely wealthy state, because everybody is going to be greedy to see this country being in that form of poverty.
Thank you, Ahmed. I think
you.
maybe I can direct the question to the panelists and ask whether there has actually been a failure to include vast sectors of the Sudanese society. Thank you, Ahmed, for your contribution.
Then we have Dr. Eva. I will seem to have lost you. Okay, Dr. Eva Khair, you should be able to unmute yourself now.
Hi, Eva.
Can you hear me?
Hi, yes, we can hear you fine. Go ahead.
Hi, Dr. Nada. Thank you for the invitation. It's really fantastic session. So thank you very much. I just wanted to sort of unpick a little bit what was said earlier by our colleague, Dr. Ali, and I know Dr. Medani or Professor Medani already touched on this, but in regards to a role, a sort of you know, there are parties that say that there needs to be a role for the military headed by whomever, but for the moment, let's say Burhan, you know, in order to secure some sort of stability or government, and there must be a role for the military. But I wondered whether, you know, what he thought, or the panel thought about the position of both SAF and the RSF, actually. You know, do we not think that they've finally shown their hand? And that, in fact, as one of the panel was saying, that this is a terrible situation, but one of the outcomes is that we have been able to see just how far they will go to secure their own futures, and that includes mass destruction on a mass scale. And so shouldn't all concerned outright refuse, and that's civil society, all interested parties, you know, organizations and mediators, shouldn't we outright refuse any power deal that involves any sort of military or paramilitary entity? You know, we haven't seen leadership except to call out UN actors. We haven't seen any bold attempts at facilitating humanitarian assistance. You know, the only edicts that have come out have been, you know, violent and sort of negative, and really all about survival, self-survival. So I just wondered about this question of military and paramilitary machinery being essential for transition to peace.
Thank you, Eva.
Oh,
Yes.
well, if you'd like for me to be objective about it, you know, prior to this war, in other context, believe it or not, paramilitaries, for example, in the former Yugoslavia, paramilitaries in some instances have been incorporated into the military. What we know with this war is that potential has just, you know, very clearly has completely fallen apart. But they were, you know, to be, you know, have been other examples of paramilitary militias integrated into the National Standing Army. That's I think a little bit of a different question than maybe what Eva had meant, and that is that as it stands, is there a way to resolve this conflict with these two gentlemen, or let's say the leadership of these two military entities? My personal opinion, or the opinion of the majority of Sudanese probably at this point, is no. I mean, they have proven time and time again, not only that they're brutal in terms of having no interest in the life of Sudanese people, but also not following through in any kind of commitment to any kind of discussion, any kind of agreement. And there's a reason for that. And the reason for that is that those agreements undermine their most important interests. And it's not just power. As I said at the beginning of my talk, it's accountability, and it's also, just to put it bluntly, it's also vast wealth. And so there is no structural reason for them to actually implement any of these agreements. That is my point of view. We were talking here, and Dr. Ali, I think, mentioned the issues of exit options and the ways of actually, in other contexts, you can actually, you know, work out an agreement without that leadership. In the case of the Sudan Armed Forces, we all know, and everyone does, that there's a difference between the Sudan Armed Forces and the committee, the Security and Intelligence Committee, that was appointed by the National Congress Party. There are two, that's understandable. There's a structural difference between the leadership of Burhan and that committee and the Sudan Armed Forces. That's what we're talking about. And that has to be part and parcel of any kind of discussion with the Sudan Armed Forces or the military, and that is ongoing. And finally, I want to say, because this is SOAS, the real point about that maybe Dr. Ali and I made is there's a structural problem with the Sudanese National Army that begins in after 1919 as a result of British colonial policy. The very weakness of the National Army in Sudan was born out of British colonial policy. I'm not going to rehearse all of that, but they also were the first to really establish what they called rapid support forces following the revolution in Egypt. What we find here in Sudan then is a historical structural issue of a weak national standing army, as in other African contexts, that was actually formed in the context of British colonialism. Like the resistance committees and the charter, as they go back in their charter to the prior history in Sudan, we have to understand that that is part and part of the colonial legacy. I am not implicating even colonialism in this horrible war today. I'm just saying there's a structural issue that has made structurally the Sudan National Army weak on purpose for political reasons. We have to understand that in order to begin a discussion about how we can truly reform standing army. And this was a central call of the revolution, Sha'bun Wahid, Jayshun Wahid. And that needs to be elaborated in the context of history, then talking about reform. I think that's what Dr. Ali and I were getting at, but not supporting Burhan or the Dagalo brothers, that's for sure.
Thank you, Khalid. Dr. Abdel Salam, do you have?
Just muting myself. Okay, I just would like to speak about one point, which is elections as a form of legitimacy. I think I know elections could be a double-edged sword, but
Dr. Abdel Salam, I think the sound on your side is just breaking up a little bit.
Oh, sorry, yeah.
Okay,
yeah,
now it's better, I think. Go ahead.
Okay. Now I think elections could be a form of legitimacy, but the problem is that how do you do elections in a transitional period? This has been tried in. I started to think more about this issue now, given the fact that the failure among the civilian forces to reach a common agreement, despite the fact that there is, as you have just spoken, there is a broad agreement about objectives and about what the people need. In my opinion, it is worth thinking more about having elected bodies and having a kind of creative ways to get and this is something that maybe was put forward in a way by the resistance committee, in the sense of having like a kind of councils, local councils that would delegate, representatives from different states to get like a national assembly or a national body. This is something that maybe people can explore somehow to see. There are definitely some hurdles about it, but at the same time, the issue of elections definitely require some work, and I wanted also to comment on the issue of that was mentioned by one of the commenters, Ahmed Barnea, about exclusion of the Islamists, because this is something that started to come again, and it is. There is first, I mean, the issue of tribal conflict and this kind of thing. This is definitely has to do with the legacy of Al-Bashir regime. I mean, I don't think we should it has to be understood in that context. But in terms of sidelining or the Islamists, there are a couple of issues about that. One is to continue. One is to basically look at the possibility that Islamists are not one bloc, and that there are differences among politically and ideologically. There are differences in terms of people who were part of the inner circle and the network, and people who were just affiliated in a different way. One way of looking at it perhaps is to maybe confine the issue of exclusion to those who have been suspected to have been part of a criminal crime that were committed during the former regime, and the issue of corruption. And this, if people can agree a formula that those who should be excluded are those who there are suspicion around them with regard to corruption or human rights violations. This is maybe something that that is not ideological, it's not political exclusion, it's not ideological exclusion. It is exclusion based on that is you want to build a foundation, a stronger foundation for democratic transformation. Because in the interest of time, I'll just confine my comment on these two issues.
Thank you, Dr. Abdeslam. On the issue of excluding those who contributed to corruption or criminal activities, there is lustration laws that were used in Eastern European countries after the fall of communist regimes, so that could be an idea. Ali, you wanted to come in, right?
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to pick up from the point Professor Madani mentioned and to comment on or try to answer Eva's question, which is the involvement of the military in the road to democracy, the transition to democracy. And I think that, I mean, I'm an advocate for democracy, and I think most Sudanese are, and I say most because I know some are not, even the Sudanese people, not just the political parties and the military faction. However, I think the main problem here is that a peaceful demonstration, a peaceful revolution cannot defeat an army, a standing army, who is in opposition to the prospects or the aspirations of the people, whether that's in Sudan or elsewhere. There are very, I think, rare examples, and context can be, used to say that these are not examples that can be repeated in history. And I don't think in the case of Sudan, they can be repeated, where a peaceful demonstration would topple an armed dictatorship. We tried this in Sudan, and we have the example of Aboud, who was toppled by a peaceful demonstration or a peaceful revolution, but he was reasonable enough to agree for a settlement where he will stay as head of state for a transitional period before giving up power. And also the example of Suad Dab. But since the 50s, maybe 60s, I think the caliber and competency of the Sudanese politicians and military people is in decline. I think this might not be the case just for Sudan, considering what's happening in the US and the UK, but in the context of Sudan, this is unfortunately the case. I don't believe that the personnel, the armed leaders of the RSF and the SAF now are the kind of people who would just succumb to a peaceful demonstration and hand power to civilians who, charted in their demonstrations that they would take them to trial and prison. So I think it's just out of sheer necessity that we need to accommodate these military factions in the transition in a well-known formula that has been used in the world throughout the history of modern states, which is giving amnesty to dictators in exchange for handing power to the civilians. And in order for this to succeed, we might need to kind of spice up the package that is given to the military men with perhaps positions in government, perhaps keeping the whatever accumulated wealth they gained in their years of rule. This all depends on the kind of balance of power that is available at the hands of the civilians, what leverage and they can use to pressure the generals out of power. And in the case of Sudan now, I think there's very little. So the solution, the practical solution that would save the lives of Sudanese people and just prevent an ongoing escalation and or ongoing conflict, armed conflict, in which the military factions would just destroy each other, but the Sudanese people along them, is to find a kind of settlement in which these generals are given some of what they are looking for in exchange for some agreement to hand power sometime in the future.
Thank you, Ali. I think that we are definitely running an hour on our original, an hour late on our original estimation. So what we're going to do right now is end with 3 questions from the audience that Rana will read out, and hopefully you will be able to handle them, you know, within the next 20 minutes or so. Rana?
Okay, so let's start with Dr. James Shirian Kandath. His question is, in terms of an eventual negotiated end to the present conflict, assuming that neither the SAF or the RSF will be able to prevail outright, who will on the ground ensure that the 2 armed forces are restrained from using force to interfere in the transition to viable civilian government? Can the AU or UN peacekeepers do this? The second question is from Abdelazim Al-Hassan. What are the prospects of a UN-sanctioned international military intervention? Would the civil society, especially the resistance committees, support it? The sort of penultimate question is from Iman Sharif, and she says, hello to you all. Many thanks for this platform. Would like to ask a question to Dr. Khalid. He mentioned that for the upcoming future, the time has passed for the FCC, that the time has passed for the FCC, and she would like you to elaborate on this if possible, and how does he see things developing? The third and great question is from Professor Abdullah Naim, and he asks, what does the first part of the title, which is how to lose a country in one day, mean? Who lost the country and to whom?
Okay, so Dr. Abdulsalam, do you want to come in on the, I assume you wanted to come in on the UN questions? Yeah.
Yes. Yes. Right. Okay. Now I think the UN, as we know, military intervention, the Chapter 7, it has to be authorized by the Security Council. I don't expect that is going to be, you know, plain sailing. First, the countries that would probably be kind of willing to do that. I don't see any signs. I mean, like the United States and the Western Bloc in that regard, if given the fact, as well as because U.S. and Saudi Arabia, as we know, were kind of you know, the most active in that regard. Even if there is a country or a group of countries from the permanent members who would put that on the table of the Security Council, I do not expect Russia and China to agree on intervention. Even if we get a resolution, which is a very long shot, in my opinion, I don't see it happening. But even if it happens, it will take at least, on average, something like 6 months for blue helmets to be on the ground. The scenario would be African Union force. African Union has not really been that active, given the fact that it hasn't really played or been actively pursuing the issue of the after the coup that Sudan has membership should be suspended and this kind of thing. If we take some examples that African Union was more active, it would have been by now more engaging, even in trying to work with the warring factions. I mean, we can see we have seen the IGAD meeting and coming back to a proposal that was put forward a couple of months ago at the beginning of the conflict, which is bringing Hameti and Burhan to meet in one of the capitals, which of course wasn't heeded then, and it is not going to be heeded now. So basically, in short, intervention under Chapter 7, I don't see it likely right now. What I see likely is probably, the having kind of more robust individual sanctions within the U.S. Saudi Arabia initiative, and that will be contingent and dependent on the activism of Sudanese lobbying. I mean Sudanese communities abroad, and unfortunately, I see it quite modest so far. So active lobbying among Sudanese community in the United States and other capitals perhaps may bring us closer to kind of having a more kind of serious in terms of pressure from particularly United States because that is the main issue. African Union, frankly speaking, I don't see it happening. Thank you.
Khalid, do you want to answer your question? We have a remaining question about whether the resistance committees are likely to be for intervention. And I don't know if Ali or Khalid want to take that on. Unfortunately, Sam had to leave, so we don't have him to tell us about that.
Yeah, I mean, I doubt the resistance committees would be for intervention, but I think that the first question about the AU, right? Is that regional actors? I think
I think the question that was for you, Rana, can you read the question for Khalid again?
Yeah, sure. You mentioned that the upcoming future, the future time has passed for the FCC. If I'm reading it right.
Yes. Oh, yes, of course. Thank you for that question. What I meant by that is, and I'm dating myself here, that this is the time for the FFC has passed because its relevance has passed. And what I mean by that is that it grew out, as you know, with the declaration of the Forces of Freedom of Change in January 2019. And that was a coalition that, of course, was headed by the Sudanese Professional Association, Sudan Call, and the National Consensus Forces. I remember even working with the National Democratic Alliance. This was some time ago. And of course, and understand the origins of even Sudan Call, where the first time you had both insurgent leaders and civil society groups and parties organizing. In Sudanese history, we have to adapt, and all of these coalitions adapt with change. I'm not saying that they did not play a role in the early part of the revolution. What I'm saying now is that there has to be a new understanding, a new coalition in civil society. This could be an opportunity. For example, just as in general, the resistance committees were excluded in the Declaration of Forces of Freedom of Change. They hadn't really organized as such at the time. Now, of course, they have played a very important role because things have changed. They represent a great deal of legitimacy without which you can't really have any kind of civil bloc coalition. And we can use that as an opportunity in order to refashion legitimate groups in civil society. rather than an FFC that was and became complicit and undermined, played a role in the undermining of the transition to democracy. Historically in Sudan, these political changes have coincided with new organizations and coalitions. Believe it or not, the Sudan Call and the National Consensus Forces had a great deal of legitimacy in Sudanese civil society, even though it was elite and middle class when they were first formed. And Sudan Call actually had legitimacy outside of Khartoum because it was born out of the conflict in South Kordofan. So, you know, those kind of things are important. It's an opportunity for, and here the Sudanese diaspora has to be included. And by diaspora, I mean those who have been forced to flee the country, as an example, in collaboration with grassroots groups. Finally, there are two things. One of them, the issue with negotiations is Saudi Arabia and particularly the United States will not let go. As you know, IGAD said even yesterday that they would support negotiations, but they wanted to play a secondary role to the United States and Saudi Arabia, by which they mean the United States. The United States cannot at this moment forego that file because of the issue of Russia and Ukraine. And so we're stuck in the middle, whereas in other African contexts, African leaders and AU has played a more important role. Now, my suspicion is that it's too important for this American file in particular that for them not to have control over it. Where does that leave us? That leaves us with the other aspect of negotiation, which is civil society. What we did not talk about is that in authoritarian and military regimes that are stable and consolidated, they have a constituency. In the context of Sudan, neither Burhan or Dagalo really have a constituency. I want to bring that home once again. Why is that important? If they had a constituency, A, there would be stability, and B, there would be a possibility of these negotiations working. We all want peace in Sudan at all costs. They are not going to work, nor will a ceasefire be implemented because there's no civil society constituency. There's no constituency, as in other contexts, that actually help to set the agenda setting of negotiations and the implementation and the tracking and monitoring of a ceasefire and the durability of resolving the conflict. This, by the way, I take from experiences and work and research on conflict resolution in other contexts. And because Abdullahi Naim honored us with his presence, I wanted to just conclude with the title. I don't see his face, but I wanted to say hello to him. How to lose a country, I thought about it. I think that it's really a question, the answer would be who has lost the country? Is the burden exclusively on Sudanese, or has the world lost the country? And I think we want to always understand the sheer wealth and resources of Sudan and the tragedy that it is so wealthy in water, resources, gold, oil, and a strategic location. And so, absolutely Sudanese have lost Sudan for the moment, but that loss has been exacerbated and I would say really, deepened by Sudan's relationship to the outside world. And that for us is unfortunate at this point. You see, I'm a professor, I talk too much. I told you, don't ask me any questions.
Professor Abdullah Naim, you're on if you want to say anything. We're obviously honored to have you here. And thank you for the question. I feel like I should answer this question, but Khalid answered it for me. So yes,
you should answer it. You came up with
it. I was actually going to say it's both Sudanese people and the international community who lost the opportunity of a democratic Sudan. But yeah, I think everybody had lost the country. Ali, any final words before we draw the session to a close?
Well, I wouldn't presume to have the final word in such a setting, but just to pick up again on the question, I think Sudan is lost only temporarily. I still maintain hope, obviously. I think that we can pick up from this, and once the dust settles, there's the opportunity for we can call it a second republic. So I'm quite hopeful. I can see Abdullah Naim's hand raised. So let's listen what he has to say.
Professor Naim, you're on.
Okay, can you hear me now? Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum assalam wa rahmah.
I think the question is much more complex than what I have heard so far. I mean, in terms of who lost the country and to whom. And I think the question is crucial because understanding that who lost the country and to whom, and understanding what loss means are critical for any discourse of what to do and how to do it and where to go from here. So if we are just simply limited to sort of romantic notions of Sudan being the Stellat Ghazal Alam or Sudan being a strategic location, all of this is with all due respect, Mustafa, I think it is true, but it's not true enough. It's not good enough. I think the question earlier about how Sudanese people being consulted, and I think our chair said that the revolution of 2019 was an occasion where all Sudanese came together, but that has not been articulated.
I agree. And
has not been channeled in a sustainable manner, because even if you have a momentary sort of emotional consensus, if it is not articulated in terms of policies, in terms of strategies, in terms of mechanisms for continued participation, it's not going to work. So I think that the question, I think, if I may say so, I meant it, and I can already see many more angles to the issues than I can articulate myself. But thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you very much for this contribution, Professor Naeem. And I think it's definitely something that we do agree on, that the sentiment has not been clearly articulated by the forces that could have done it. We would definitely like to hear from you about the other aspects of this that we haven't really tackled, but thank you very much for the question and for being here as well.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you. All right, so thank you. I would like to say a thank you to all of my panelists today. For one thing, thank you for bearing with us going over time. I've held you here not knowing what else you have going on. We have unfortunately lost Hussam in the final part of the panel, but we're very grateful that he was able to join us from Sudan under these conditions. This is a part of an attempt by us to start a dialogue on these issues, but particularly on law and politics in Sudan. And when we first conceptualized the research seminar series, we were very aware that there are new political thinkers and new political ideas emerging from the country as well. So I definitely hope that the conversation will continue, and of course we hope that the conflict in Sudan ends soon. I personally think it will, but I don't know how emotional or objective that is. But hopefully the next time we have this conversation, it will be in conditions of peace. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's been an honor and privilege.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, include us in your next series.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I second Professor Madani. It's been an honor. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.